Something I've noticed about genre in video games that is relatively unique to the medium is what I'll refer to as like genres. Games which fit within these genres are defined in relation to a different game, which that game is like. The most prevalent example of this in games today is the roguelike, named after the game Rogue released over 4 decades ago in 1980. As a game, Rogue is defined by its randomly generated levels and permadeath aspects, which would go on to define the roguelike genre. Decades later, roguelikes would become one of the most prolific genres in indie development, spanning many major indie releases such as The Binding of Isaac, Risk of Rain, Spelunky, Nuclear Throne, and Downwell, just to name a few of the ones I'm most familiar with. There's even an offshoot of this genre, the roguelite, characterized by random level generation and permadeath, but also permanent unlockables that carry over between runs, which games like Rogue Legacy characterize perfectly. And the blueprint for all of these games can be traced back to a single game from decades ago, whose influence is still felt today. I find it interesting that some games can bring such innovation and smart design to the table that they are able to invent new genres simply through their creation. I think to pull off a game of this strength, such that years or even decades later, people will be comparing and relating their game to yours, is probably the greatest honor one could achieve as a designer. So having said that, let's talk about A Short Hike. A Short Hike is easily one of the most tightly designed games I've ever played. Everything from the movement, to the world design, to the art direction, to the sound design, to the game's writing and overall story coalesces into a wonderful experience that is so easy to pick up and enjoy. Though if you've heard anyone else describe this game, all that is probably old news to you. So instead, I'd like to take this in a different direction. I'd like to analyze A Short Hike as the beginnings of a new genre. In the same way that Rogue began the roguelike, and Demon's Souls and Dark Souls began the Souls-like, what if A Short Hike was the start of another, the Hikelike, if you will? What sort of design would this genre be defined by? I think it's an interesting topic, so that's what I'd like to talk about here. There are two main aspects of A Short Hike that define it as an experience: tone and world design. To start with the former, I would describe the tone of the game as being, in a word, pleasant. Every facet of the game's presentation builds a comforting and calming presence that makes for a world that is a joy to inhabit. The deliberate use of a specific color palette with generous contrast creates a style where everything visually pops. Every frame is an inviting photo into an idealized world of natural beauty, with the pixelation filter softening the rougher edges, considering this is a mostly one-man indie project. And of course, I can't help but mention the music. The game's soundtrack easily has some of the best music I've ever heard, game soundtrack or not. It's all just so upbeat and easy on the ears, complementing the natural joy of exploration through the modular music system, as well as the game's tone through its soft, simple instrumentation. The story of A Short Hike is incredibly simplistic by design, as its design promotes a relaxed comfort when it comes to pursuing that story. Nothing is pressuring you to make progress towards an eventual ending, and this gives ample attention to the supporting cast and their side stories. Spreading positivity around the island is just as cathartic in an emotional sense as it is cathartic in terms of the gameplay rewards for taking interest in these mini-stories, and it makes moving through this world emotionally less of a rocky climb and more like a pleasant glide. This relaxing, pleasant tone is an intrinsic part of A Short Hike's appeal, so I think it's fair to say that it's also an integral part of the Hikelike. The other integral part of A Short Hike is its world design, which is what sets the game apart from its contemporaries in terms of gameplay. Hawk Peak Provincial Park is a fully continuous open world full of interesting landmarks and various items to find and use, though I use open world there in a very specific way. The connotation when someone says open world is not just a freely explorable world, but also a world of massive scale, and as open world games have become more commonplace, many have realized that they oftentimes don't use that massive scale particularly well. A Short Hike, on the other hand, is an exemplary product of open world design because it's what I like to call a compact open world. It's open world by virtue of the world being fully explorable with no arbitrary progression gates, but the scale is kept small, which comes with a lot of positives aside from the dev time saved by not making a bigger world. Compact open worlds are less susceptible to the issue of underutilized space in larger open worlds, which helps to alleviate player boredom by consistently using the design space in new and interesting ways. This helps greatly with pacing, which is clearly quite important to a short hike given its title. This sort of compact world design combined with the use of verticality in that world allows for intensely rewarding exploration. The main rewards for exploration are the golden feathers, which make the traversal of the world's vertical layout a much simpler process. This is a brilliant feedback loop, where exploration is rewarded with easier access to more areas, which encourages further exploration, though in keeping with the game's laid-back tone, a good 90% of the game is entirely optional, as you can complete the game with as few as 0 feathers with the right route. And if you do decide to do everything and explore every corner of the island, since finding feathers gets less rewarding as the game goes on, the aforementioned side characters and their stories written with such authentic character provide plenty of emotional reward for the time you put into the post-game. It's this focus on the free exploration of a compact open world that I think defines the gameplay of the Hikelike. With this, we can distill the Hikelike into 2 main design traits: a pleasant, carefree tone focused on promoting a warm, fuzzy feeling of joy, and gameplay focused around the free exploration of a relatively small open world. And following a short hike's release, I've played 2 other games that I think fit quite comfortably into this genre: Alba, a wildlife adventure, and Haven Park, with the latter falling much more in line with a short hike's design principles than the former. You could probably make the argument that it's more rip-off than inspiration, with a similar collection of environments, similar aesthetics despite the lack of a pixelation filter, similar character design and similar music that all clearly take after a short hike. However, it does set itself apart with a larger but still manageable open world, with some building mechanics that harken back to Animal Crossing, as you're able to build campsites and attract campers that give simple side quests. I couldn't call Haven Park a great game, but it's the perfect example of what could be called a traditional Hikelike. In comparison, Alba is much more of an iteration on the Hikelike formula as set by a short hike, rather than a derivative. It has the small open world and the pleasant visual design and tone, but it weaves together a more traditional linear narrative on top of that foundation that gives players more to do in between their exploratory wildlife photography sessions. If anything, that narrative helps build that tone past the point that a short hike took it to, providing a much stronger feel-good fantasy that has the player character saving their idealized Mediterranean island from a cartoonishly evil personification of corporate greed. It's the sort of hyperbolic positivity that does an excellent job satisfying one's hunger for escapist fiction, and while this is ostensibly the purpose of all 3 of these games, Alba might just be the best at it for a lot of people, especially if you can get past the narrative's self-indulgent simplicity. But I think the most exciting thing about the Hikelike is how much more there is to explore with this genre, especially in terms of the focus on exploration. Exploration is generally one of the strongest aspects of game design when it comes to player engagement and storytelling. Entire games like Gone Home have been built solely around player-driven exploration and environmental storytelling, which speaks to the strength of exploration as a design tool that it can carry an experience despite a complete lack of traditional gameplay. Haven Park is not a particularly great game, especially not from a writing standpoint, but it's still one I enjoyed well enough because of the novelty of its world and the free exploration the game allows, and that alone carried the experience for me. Alba shows how that exploration can be built upon with more traditional narrative techniques, and through that shows how much space this genre has left to grow out into. This is why I want to see more games that follow this formula, because I think there's so much more potential in this genre, even despite a short hike's near-immaculate design. Think about it this way. You can think of a short hike as a Hikelike 3D platformer, Haven Park as a Hikelike casual city builder, and Alba as a Hikelike collectathon. I'd say that there's more design space to explore with these 3 genre fusions, and also that there are probably more potential fusions out there. One particular combination that I'd love to see is a Hikelike mystery game. Implementing Outer Wilds-style lore puzzles into a game with a short hike's tone and world is an experiment that I would love to see, and with the right vision I could see it working quite well in practice. While I won't make any strong predictions here, I think there's a lot of potential for more games in this style, and I think that the Hikelike is something to look out for in the future.